Hello, I'm Tailinh Agoyo, and you're listening to From Here with a View, a We Are the Seeds Philadelphia podcast. Today, we're at Philly Cam's Express Studio with artist, director, and cultural strategist Wilfredo Hernandez. Wilfredo is the founder and executive producing director of the Drag Arts Oral History Project, a multimedia initiative documenting the histories and artistry of drag artists in Philadelphia and beyond. This interdisciplinary work centers storytelling, cultural memory, and community care rooted in identity and resistance. Wilfredo is also the founder and CEO of Communitas Arts and Culture, LLC, with a 20-year career that includes leadership roles at Lincoln Center, The Field, and Culture Works Greater Philadelphia, and recent fellowships with the American German Institute, Philadelphia Latino Arts and Film Festival, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and Drexel University's Writers' Room. His work holds complexity, uplifts community, and reflects his commitment to creating opportunities for learning and understanding around a beautiful art practice, bringing long overdue acknowledgement to the artists and the histories he centers. Here now is my conversation with Wilfredo. So today I'm here with Wilfredo Hernandez, who is a dear friend and colleague. We've worked together for a very long time, many years.
Yeah.
And today we're talking about Wilfredo's Drag Arts Oral History Project. And I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. We've just worked together in so many different areas, and this is something that is basically, it's your baby, and it's something that's taking shape in this incredible way. And I'd really like to get into the Drag Arts Oral History Project's origin story. If you could tell me how it was born and what inspired you to start it.
Yeah, first, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Drag Arts Oral History Project. It's been a seed for a long time. So I've been working in arts and culture, you know this, for over 20 years. And I remember working in New York in arts administration, helping artists get grants, helping them strategize. And I always felt like, you know, drag as an art form is like really relegated to nightlife, and you know, it wasn't connected to the greater arts and culture community that I've worked in, especially in New York, where queer, not just nightlife, but queer culture is so celebrated, and it's a really diverse city, right, across all 5 boroughs. So I noticed a gap, I want to say more than 10 years ago. So the inkling of this idea has been in my head for a long time. And it wasn't until the pandemic, actually, when I was, you know, then based here in Philadelphia, that I noticed that this group of artists, right, these creatives, had no infrastructure around them to help support them in the way that arts organizations did during that time, or even independent, quote unquote, artists had at that time. So, you know, I was in the neighborhood and frequenting, you know, of course, masked and practicing social distancing. But there was something about seeing the resiliency of that community in that moment, you know, going to a bar and watching, you know, a drag artist perform in a full face shield, rhinestone face shield, you know, fabulous.
Beautiful.
And just making it work, and still doing whatever they could do to share their artistry, their humor, their critical perspectives on not only the community, but what was happening at the time.
Can I interrupt you for a second? And can you give our viewers and listeners, explain what drag arts are?
Yes, I can. So I term it as drag arts. Most people, you know, I think when they think of drag queens. I use the more inclusive term of drag arts because it's not a gendered binary kind of classification for a genre of performance that can really incorporate a lot of different things, right? And it's not just always about kind of an older school definition of drag might be like female impersonation. And that's what people typically think of when they think of RuPaul's Drag Race, or, you know, movies like To Wong Fu or The Birdcage, shows like We're Here on HBO, and things that have entered the cultural zeitgeist, right? Or cultural memory. I think I know it's a much more expansive art form, not just based on the work we've done with this project, but also just, you know, as a queer person who navigates the world. I've seen drag kings. I've seen folks who don't identify as a monarch or drag monarchy at all. And, it usually incorporates a lot of elements, musical theater sometimes, choreography, lip syncing, variety acts, right? Comedy. There are definite spaces that have burlesque elements to it. And it's just a really diverse art form. And, obviously we're going to get into the politics later, but I think that people writ large have a really narrow definition of what they understand drag to be. And the purpose of this project was really to expand that, expand folks' understanding of drag as an art form, and one that's rooted and grounded in its own history, just like every other art form.
So thank you for explaining that. You mentioned before that during COVID, you would go to the neighborhood and there were certain places where you could see drag shows. And that was kind of the only access, that there was the resources or the structure, the systems were not around in the arts community to support drag artists. Mm-hmm. Can you, do an explanation for our listeners who are not in Philadelphia, what the neighborhood is, this very special neighborhood?
Absolutely.
Let's start there, and then we'll go on to the next question.
Yeah, the neighborhood is a geographic neighborhood location in Philadelphia, Center City. Recently, that area of the city also got a historical designation. It's like maybe, 6-block radius about, and it's the hub of queer nightlife and culture. It's where the William Way LGBT Center is. It's where they also house archives there. So it's the epicenter of nightlife and great food and music and dining and all that fun stuff. And I think Philadelphia is unique in the landscape nationally because of gentrification over the past 20, 30 years, right? We're seeing neighborhoods die out across the country and costs rising, so it's harder to maintain rent and maintain spaces. Our neighborhood is also unique in the sense of there are a few venues that have really great performing facilities, like actual full stages, lighting grids, and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's really unique in the landscape, like compared to New York or Chicago and things like that.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. So Philadelphia is ahead of the game.
In some ways. There's always work to be done, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's talk about the project. So you have these ideas, you see that there's a need, but when did you actually say, okay, this is what it's called, this is how I want it to look, I'm making the website, I'm reaching out to folks, I'm getting support folks, and I'm trying to access funding so that this can really happen?
Happen by happenstance, right? And, and I think you know this from your work with We Are the Seeds, is that sometimes you're in the right place at the right time, or you have the right connection. And I ran a previous oral history project when I was living in New York called the LGBTQ New Americans Oral History Project with the Brooklyn Community Pride Center.
Where is that accessible?
That's
on website,
YouTube.
On YouTube.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can just type in LGBTQ New Americans Oral History Project. Okay. And it's free and accessible to the public. And that oral history project documented queer immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees who were living in New York at the time. The interesting part of that project, which really instilled the love of oral history as a form for me, was started in 2016. It was pre-Trump election, but it was in the run-up to that election. So immigration was a very nuanced and important topic, just like it is now. And at that point, we partnered with Immigration Equality in New York to help connect our organization to folks on the ground, advocates who are working for immigration reform. We had over, I think, 15 oral histories documented over several years. And that was really my first foray into oral history as a methodology. And what I love most about what oral history offers is the narrative agency part. So me as an interviewer, I come in, of course, nothing is 100% informed by not an agenda, but an interest, right? And at that point, there was no project out there, to my knowledge, that was addressing that topic. And I think, through the support of the Brooklyn Pride Center, we were able to build a really robust program for folks. And that also got me into thinking, like, how do we compensate people holistically for telling their stories, for reliving emotional traumas and the emotional labor of storytelling. So I really got, a crash course in thinking through all of those components. And as a producer, that's really, I think, where I thrive, but also it's what I care about. It's like, how do we take care of the folks who are sharing their work, their lives with us? It's a really vulnerable place to be. And I carried that through with this project. There's never enough funding, ever. And you do your best with the resources that you have. But I am very adamant about people need to be paid. People need to be compensated for their time and for their labor and for their experience, right? They're sharing artistry that's been honed sometimes for 20, 30 years. So the same way that we, formal arts and culture land, would respect a violinist or a ballet dancer or somebody who has mastered a technical craft, right? I think that extends the same here.
So I'm just curious, the last project that you were talking about, and people telling their own stories in their own voices and how important that is. What was the outcome of that project?
And we were awarded honorary citation by the New York City Council in recognition of that work. The outcome of that project, I think, aside from the documentation of it and the importance of recording those stories, I think we really got to highlight the great work of a life-saving organization too, like Immigration Equality. So it's about the individual experiences, but what I also try to do usually is bring in partners, right? And so that we have like a fuller context around the issues we're talking about, which is like we're doing here today, right? About the Drag Arts Oral History Project and connecting it further, right, to ideas around gender, ideas around decolonizing gender, and talking about identity in a way that is non-binary and is different than, especially what this current government is trying to impose on not just the art form, but on lives in general. And luckily, we've been really fortunate to have key partners, not just community partners like We Are the Seeds and Philadelphia Latino Film Festival, Arts and Film Festival, but our funder, like Independence Public Media Foundation, who has championed this work from the founding of it. And if it wasn't for funders like that, trust-based funders who remove the barriers to access of capital, right, and resource, financial resource, but also putting grantees in contact and conversation with each other like this. So, yeah.
Yeah. You talked about colonial mindset and now how prevalent that kind of thinking is because of the new administration. And can you talk a little bit about your background, where your family is from? And I know that you've been doing some research and going back to your roots and family, and incorporating those traditions and ways of being into the work that you're currently doing.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a real privilege to be able to do that work. I've been thinking about it more as repair work because it is a part of my family's lineage or history that has been lost because of colonization and white supremacy culture. So my dad's Puerto Rican, and my family is, he was born in Puerto Rico in Aguadilla, and my grandparents, his parents, are from Moca. Did my DNA a few years back because I was curious, and growing up, I always heard that we had Taino ancestry throughout the family on my grandmother's side. And my grandmother, didn't speak English much, until the day she passed. But she exuded this sense of spirit and this sense of love and this sense of like grounded knowledge that sometimes felt inaccessible because of language, but it was there. and you can
that
feel
was
it.
how you were able to communicate.
Yeah.
That's
And
beautiful.
I mean, I think about it now and it feels like magic,
Yes.
and it's a spark that brings me a lot of joy, mostly through cooking, through like herbal remedies. When we were sick, her tea, I still don't know what was in that tea, but I would get better all the time. And like, just more traditional ways of thinking about our bodies and thinking about family and space. So the way that she held space, I remember even, growing up in the apartment in New York, and they were the first Puerto Rican family to move into Greenwich Village and like on their block when they did so. And so they had to assimilate very quickly. And you're talking about a family of 5, 3 boys and 2 girls. The challenges that they face, not just around language, but around the economics of it and jobs and putting 5 kids through Catholic school at that time. I have no idea. And I say all of that because there was a lot of erasure also. And so we were Puerto Rican on Sundays when we would visit them, and we would tap into culture and then go home. I don't blame anyone in my family for that, right? They were,
It's a lot to navigate.
it's a lot to navigate.
And it's a different time.
Way different time, right? You're also talking about like the neighborhood they grew up in was also like mafia controlled,
for safety.
and it was safety reasons, economic reasons. So I say all of that to say is like, come to learn through the results of the DNA tests and like research, family archival research, which we should be doing a better job of archiving our lineages that have a significant percentage of Indigenous Puerto Rican tracing in the results. And I know the science of these things are complicated and nuanced and problematic. And, the way that I've been approaching it is just doing the internal work and learning and filling in the gaps of my own understanding and things that you don't learn in school, and visiting Puerto Rico as much as I can and immersing myself in the culture of the island, in the politics, the history of displacement, colonization, not just by the United States, right? Spain and the Dutch, and then Spanish again. And here we are now. And all of those issues are still very much alive for the people in Puerto Rico, but also the people in the diaspora. So in Philadelphia, which I came to learn after I moved here, is home to the second largest population of Puerto Ricans outside of the island. So only second to New York.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So that's the work that I've been doing around my own heritage, and I'm also a product of Roman Catholic school upbringing, and the history of the role that organized religion has played in colonization, and around concepts of particularly gender and sexuality, which has always impacted my life as a queer person of color. It's a really big knot to untangle or to begin pulling, right? Because you're not going to figure it all out, especially alone. And that's why we need to be in conversation with each other now more than ever, I feel like. Not just in conversation, but in action together too. I think like just a little nerdy tidbit there is like, if you zoom out, it's happening nationally. This kind of work, and like this year it's Hispanics in philanthropy and Native Americans in philanthropy are having a joint conference this year. We need more of that solidarity instead of everyone in their own lanes. I think we're stronger together. The way that this work is developing, so we're entering our 4th year of production. We have 17 full oral histories documented of Philadelphia-based drag artists. We specifically prioritized BIPOC voices first and foremost in this collection. And, it was important for us to get a lay of the land, like a real sense of what is it like to be producing and creating drag art now. So we really prioritized talking to producers and folks who've been doing this work, in some cases more than 20 years, but the minimum we were like, 3 or more years, 5 or more years of producing, so that you have a sense of the economics behind it, the systems at play that are impacting your ability to do the work, so that we could really understand the full context.
So you're in your fourth year, but when you first started the project, how did you decide who you were going to interview, and what were the age ranges and the diversity of experience?
Wildly diverse, you know, and also like Philly is such a vibrant, diverse city to begin with.
So they were all mostly Philly-based the first year, or
They've all been Philly-based to date, yeah. So the 17 artists that we've talked to are all Philadelphia-based, and we tried our best to create an intergenerational cohort. The age ranges were, you know, oldest probably over 60, youngest early 20s, mid 20s. So it runs a wide gamut. And I think the interesting part there is that you have people who learn drag almost in the same way like that folk and traditional art forms are passed down generation to generation, right? Practices are taught and refined and built upon, right? It's an iterative process versus, and I'm not saying that what I'm about to say isn't iterative, versus somebody who grew up watching RuPaul's Drag Race and learned the art of drag in that way, or learned makeup through makeup tutorials on YouTube. So you're talking about a different level of access, right? Accessibility. It's really interesting when you know, you're talking to folks and everybody has their own definition of drag also, right? You know, I was trained as a theater artist my whole life, and so you're coming into your own work with like a really like a culture. You're bringing a culture of practice, right? Or technique, or a school of aesthetic, right? Depending on what kind of theater you're making, or kind of dance or music or whatnot.
And no matter how hard you try, it's hard to step away from it.
It's really hard to step away from it because also you're trying to fit your work into boxes and lanes so that you can get more work and so that you can have commercial success to continue making work. Drag's different, you know. Drag is, because it comes from the underground and it's enjoying mainstream success now in a lot of ways, like pop culture success, but people don't understand where it comes from because queer history is also, like many of our history, is one of those things that was not documented, or it was distorted and manipulated like we're seeing today. So when you think about drag, I feel like most people automatically think of a nightclub. And those political conversations that are happening at the state levels, mostly, they're not talking about a federal drag ban at this point, but a state just proposed a law that would make it a felony to bring a minor to a drag performance in public. Drag in a nightclub at midnight is going to look very different than drag at a pride festival, or drag in a parade, or drag queen story time, and things like that. And I think what's missing from this conversation is, and it has been brought up by the artists themselves, is like, well, I'm an artist. I know my audience. In the same way that a comedian or a musician can temper their material to be appropriate for the audience they're performing for, we can do that too. And so what's happening now is happening because people don't understand that this is a legitimate art form with a long and varied history, not just in an American context, but in a global one. And we didn't always have the language that we have today. We know that. So it wasn't called drag. And like, we're going back to ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, you know, like all across the world, there's no culture that doesn't know this form of artistry or this form of expression, right?
So you've explained the project and talked about how you got to this point. What do you hope that people will take away from this project, whether it's the folks who are part of the drag community and those who are outside of it?
Great question. I want people to take away a deeper understanding of what this is and what this means for the people who are doing it, not the people who are interpreting it.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Sorry.
Like, because it's always, that's always on the forefront of the mind in the work that we're doing. It's about us.
Yeah.
Other people can learn from it and be impacted and appreciate and all those things, but it's about the people who are part of it.
There's multiple stakeholder groups that you're thinking. There are funders, there are, you know, because part of this work is also, how can we move resource? How can we, to folks who don't have access to traditional modes of support, like tax-exempt 501c3 organizations do if you're a theater company or, an after-school program and all the things that are being targeted today in civil society, the things that make American culture diverse and rich are on the chopping block. So I think funders do have a role to play in this moment, of course, for all of us, right? And for everyone's work who's trying to advance equity. But for this group of artists, the economics of drag are stark. And that's one of the findings that we learned through this project. As a producer, I'm always worried about not just money, but there are other kinds of resource to do work, and you're building community, you're building relationships. How do you leverage all of these things to make the thing happen? And that's why I use the term cultural producer for my work, because for me, it's not an end goal game of, commercial success, right? Or financial success. It's about what is the short, medium, long-term impacts of the work, right? Exactly. And so if equity is a cultural idea, a value, a practice, then we as producers, if we're solving for X when we're trying to make X amount of money, sell X amount of tickets, try to do all these things, get X amount of people in the door, serve X amount of people, we can also solve for solve for equity, right? And solve for how to create the longer term impacts, I think. And I think that's where the narrative change and narrative strategy work comes in. So storytelling is key to all of our cultures by practice and by value. I think that this project, at least in what we've heard so far, and again, this is a limited pool of folks that we've talked to in Philadelphia. And as we're thinking about how do we build this out and how do we expand, expanding isn't always about increasing numbers. It's about going deeper, yes. Right? So, and I think that's what we're doing here today, but also going forward, that's what we're trying to do. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I agree. I want to talk about the fundraising piece of it because like you said, there are other resources and there are other things that can help lift artists in communities, but fundraising and funds are really essential. And in that type of work, there's a requirement where we have to kind of prove our value or prove that our projects have value or that our communities are worth investing in. How does that make you feel?
That part. How does it make you feel? We could talk about this all day, right? So I'm just
yeah.
I think also and I'm sure you navigate this too, right? Is that when a funding opportunity arises, specifically around it being BIPOC focused or serving, the metrics by which I feel like grant makers are usually, I'll say, assessing. And I should say, I'm not trying to paint everyone with a giant brush, because there are funders that are like IPMF and other trust-based funders who are walking the walk.
They're constantly assessing themselves, and looking at how they can be of value, which is why we're sitting here today. Right. Both our teams, right? So that's really the ideal situation, but it's very rare.
And this is where the greater American public just doesn't understand unless you're in this work. I don't want to say you can't appreciate the rigor and that we all have to.
The energy, the mental energy, the emotional energy, and it takes up a lot of time and space, and it takes time away from the actual work.
Yeah, the dance that you have to do, not just in courting the funders, because sometimes these grant opportunities are by invitation only. And, when you're trying to get the attention of a large national or international foundation to fund your work, it's a numbers game. You and I, as producers and as cultural leaders, we're constantly assessing the ground, and we're constantly saying, is this worth the lift, right? Because like you said, it'll take me away from doing the actual work. So the way that we've approached it so far, IPMF has funded us largely to produce the work. And we've had a few other forms of support from the Delaware Valley Legacy Fund, and we were a co-recipient of a grant with Beyond the Bell Tours, a great group here in Philadelphia who does historically inclusive tours of Philadelphia, including a queer history tour, the Gayborhood, and a women's history tour. We received a co-grant with them from Villanova University to develop a public walking tour about drag history in Philadelphia. So, and I would have never dreamed that the work would have been able to be applied in that way. So I'm hopeful, even given the challenges of the day, that this work and the impact of the work will resonate with folks who are trying to advance equity in the fullest sense of the term. The economics of drag put the onus on the individual. So when you look at Drag Race, you're watching tens of thousands of dollars in investment in those costumes, in the wigs, in the makeup. We know through some of the data, right, that we've heard from our artists here in Philadelphia, that bars are paying $100 to an artist. That's their booking fee. Come out for the night for $100 in full drag, perform for 2 hours, and enjoy your tips. And that's your pay.
It's just disrespectful.
At that point, it's extremely disrespectful because you're not even appreciating the time and the self-investment in that equation. I think one of our artists, Eric Jaffe, who we talked to, a prominent drag artist here in Philadelphia, every time they get in drag, they're using $100 worth of materials, because then you're also not thinking about, oh, well, yeah, that dress needs to get washed or dry cleaned, or those pads need to be washed, that wig needs to be cleaned, your brushes need to be cleaned, you need to replace your brushes, oh, your makeup palette, it's ruined, So the level of investment, the level of care are things the public doesn't see and doesn't understand, just like any art form, right? You always see the final product.
Yeah, and you're talking about years of experience, possibly,
Yeah.
And then even at bare minimum, the transportation to get there. I mean,
Yes.
$100 is nothing.
Thank you for bringing up the transportation part, because in a city especially, because of gentrification, not a lot of the artists live in the neighborhood either. So they have to travel considerable lengths sometimes and safely. Can't take public transit in drag necessarily. So you're looking at, anywhere between $30 to $50 sometimes for a round trip car. So there goes half your pay from the night. We've also heard from artists is like, oh, bars will give me a drink ticket and no food though. So when you think about it in reverse, and I'm not putting total blame on the nightlife establishments either, it's a symbiotic relationship. And there are really great people in the neighborhood who are doing things better and who are doing things more equitably. People are going to that bar to see the show, sometimes buying tickets, but the alcohol sales, the food sales, they're there all night. And the establishment is making the money. And we haven't talked to any of the bar owners as part of this project. We've really been focusing on artists, but eventually if we get to a point where we have the funding and we have the staffing capacity, I would love to have it be a more fulsome conversation, including with the business community and nonprofit and arts and culture community, like institutions. Because institutions have space. Institutions do have resources, usually limited, but there's ways to do this better and to do right by the folks who are, in a lot of ways, giving up a lot for somebody else to benefit, more often than not, economically at least. Right?
And so it's wonderful that you have this website and that you are starting, that people have, there's a structure now where people can go to learn and see these videos and to have a better understanding of all of the things that you're talking about, so that you can start building this understanding where there can be more value and more equity. And then I love that what started as interviews, oral history, and is now you're talking about things that are so much bigger, and how it's developed in 4 short years, and that you have this vision going forward that is just so huge. a few months ago, we had a conversation, and this podcast idea was born about, and it was so exciting. Now it just seems so obvious, but I'm so thankful that you brought it up in a conversation. And now we have this wonderful vision for the coming year, where we'll be going outside of Philadelphia to reach out to Indigenous and Native drag artists. Yes. And so what's your hope for that?
Number one, thank you for welcoming us in as a partner, and trusting us, right, to be part of the community and to lift up this conversation together. There's this really brilliant book by a scholar, Karim Kubchandani, called Decolonize Drag. I read this a year ago, and we can talk about decolonization efforts writ large. How do we decolonize an art form? What I loved most about the book is that it talks about even how in drag, what is typically understood to be the ideal drag experience, or not ideal, but like typical drag experience, is you're gonna go to a bar, you're gonna see a drag queen come out and perform lip sync to a diva, usually a white diva, right? Like Cher. And there's iconic songs in the gay community and in queer culture and nightlife that is still rooted in whiteness and standards of beauty, quote unquote, body and design and aesthetics and just different cultural values that certain places, institutions, and artists will put emphasis on. This book does a brilliant job of breaking all of that down and saying, hey, we need to have a deeper conversation, actually go back to the beginning and start of all of this. And you can't talk about drag without talking about gender and gender identity and expression and the limiting of such throughout history. For me, that was a real eye-opening moment. I've seen a handful of Latinx drag shows, performances, in Puerto Rico, but also here. And it's different.
How?
And I mean, not just the aesthetics, but obviously music selections, the messaging of the visual aesthetics juxtaposed with the music and with the crowd or with the space you're performing in sometimes. So it's like when you look at the whole thing, the whole experience, right, as a holistic experience, I think there's a lot to be unpacked. If we were able to zoom out, which I think is our endeavor, right, is to zoom out together and have a deeper conversation about gender identity, colonization, how that does or doesn't play into certain folks' artistry. We ask I think one of the more interesting questions in the project is, do you think drag is inherently political, like an inherently political act? Some people say yes, some people say no. And I think when you're part of any marginalized group, historically, there is this element of, when maybe answering that question, is no, when I leave my house in drag, that's not an inherently political act. When I leave my house in my black or brown body, that's also an inherently political act in this country, in the context of the United States, because racism is baked into the founding of this country and the psyche of this country. And we're down the street from the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall, and we're on the cusp of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. That has been realized, those values have been realized for a lot of people, but not everybody. And so how do we have that deeper conversation, especially in this political moment, nationally, and go back to the start and not uplift, but how do we amplify the people who are already thinking these things, talking about these things, and doing the critical work of deconstructing and rebuilding through their artistry. So, and I think that's where we're talking with Indigenous drag artists about all of these intersections and how that manifests in their work. For me, it's a two-pronged approach. And I was like, we can't have a national conversation without also, and for me, involving Puerto Rico as it exists as a colony of the United States currently. And so I'm really excited to expand the lens with you all and with your communities. But also, it's not about me. I'm not a drag artist, I'm a producer. And so I see my job and my role is really about marshaling resources and connections and community and helping to build the infrastructure for the artists to do this work themselves and with each other. So
that is so well put. Thank you. So we had a conversation a couple months ago about, I know you've been watching the ACLU and a lot of the policies that are changing or being threatened. And you had some statistics that were really staggering, and I'm sure they've changed by now too. I don't know how to put it. People's lives are at stake right now. And your project is a really important part of making sure that stories get told and people have a better understanding, because there's so much misinformation out there, and we're just being bombarded with a lot of hate and changing policy. So one, can you tell us where the threats are as you see them? And two, how will you navigate working on your project and within drag communities to try to make things better and not as terrifying, and to make sure that community feels heard and safe as much as possible in this time?
I think first and foremost, we have made conscious decisions around what questions we ask the artists and what we choose to prioritize as an organization. And I think you and I have had this conversation about, like, we are the seeds also, and it's in the name, right? We're the seeds. And there is, I think the resistance is in the joy and the solidarity that we find and make together, right? And I think that's true for every historical moment, every movement, every fight for greater equity and fairness and justice throughout history. I try, as the producer, because I hold all of it in my head, and I have an amazing team behind me, supporting and pushing, and actually not behind me, they're with me. You know what I mean? And I try not to let the news or the legislation deter my line of sight. And so this is about art, and it's about free expression, First Amendment rights. It's about censorship at this point, because that's what we're starting to see. It's about erasure. You know, we saw the drag bans start to be proposed over 2 years ago at the state levels as a way in to targeting the trans and non-binary communities. And the insidious part of it all is that if you look at those threads and those through lines, is you want to limit drag in the public sphere. Does that mean if I go out wearing a coded feminine piece of clothing that I'm performing drag right now, and I walk past a child on the street, does that meet your criteria to arrest me or charge me with a felony, which they, you know, in some of the legislation, they're going to be that extreme. They're trying to be that extreme. So last year, the ACLU was tracking over 500 pieces of legislation nationally, not related to drag solely. I think there were 30 something, I don't know the exact numbers. They should be singed into my memory at this point, but you're right, it has changed already. And so I think, and I use the word insidious purposefully, because if you're trying to limit bodily autonomy, freedom of expression, you're trying to alter language in a fundamental way, as to say the United States government will only recognize male and female genders. I mean, this is unprecedented. Like, we haven't lived through anything like this yet. And I think a lot of organizations out there funders in particular are waiting to see where the chips fall legally, like through these court cases that are currently moving their way through the courts. 2 days ago, the Supreme Court declined to hear a challenge to Tennessee's drag ban, which passed at the state level and is law. That's troubling because it leaves the current laws in place, right? And the ACLU also has a drag defense fund. People like RuPaul and artists on RuPaul's Drag Race have done a great job of fundraising for that cause. But I haven't seen like a mass mobilization around this issue yet. And so for me, my challenge and call to action for the arts and culture community is, if you're not standing up right now for the freedom of expression of this group of artists, you're going to be next. Like, who's to say this theater company, you're not allowed to perform this kind of show anymore, or traditional and folk artists, or folks who are preserving cultural traditions. If that fits a definition of the government's concept of DEI, who's to say they're not going to scrap that? I know that there's efforts underway, like nationally, for the 250th anniversary, for work to only be exploratory or celebratory of the Declaration of Independence. And what about critique of the Declaration of Independence? What about critique of the government's history of genocide and displacement, of slavery? That is history. That is fact, factually based, and you can't just erase it because you took down a government website, right? So all of these things, it's a confluence of all of these issues, and I think when it gets down to the act of limiting healthcare and housing and education, that's a whole nother level of cruelty. It's a whole nother level of animus and I want to say genocide, in a way that is enabling people out there to exercise hate, right? In a systemic way and in a direct confrontational way in the streets. And I know those words are very strong words, and those are loaded words and terms for the Indigenous community, for Black and Brown communities. Historically, the queer community, I think, owes a debt of gratitude to drag artists. If we look back at Stonewall and we look back at our own history and the role that what we didn't have the terminology for back then in terms of like trans-inclusive language and trans-affirming language, you know, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, both women of color. And I still sit in queer spaces that don't acknowledge that rightfully, in terms of like, we wouldn't be where we are, right, without those individuals.
People aren't educated on that.
Right.
So that's all really heavy stuff. Yeah. And it's important to stay away from the news and stay focused, you know, understand what's going on, be prepared, but also focus on the work that we're doing, because being distracted is part of that strategy, right?
Yes. Yeah.
They want us to be distracted. They want us to break down and not be able to continue.
Right.
And our work is so important.
And Tailinh, I'm not a lawyer. And there are many talented lawyers out there who can litigate this and put our work in context with the movements and the legislation and the issues. We're artists.
Right.
And that's why this project is about the art of drag. And the politics are part of that. It's a component, but it's first and foremost about the creativity, the vibrancy, the joy that these individuals bring and cultivate through their work, right? And that's really important to me, to center that. And you know, when we're interviewing folks, we're eating, we're having fun, you know, like we're in community with each other,
and they feel seen and valued and acknowledged, and that is huge.
And that has to remain. Like, for me, that's critical.
Yeah. Well, I think you answered my last question. Thank you so much for the work that you do, for
Thank
your
you.
brilliance, and for your dedication and energies that you're always pushing to make things better. And not just for your own communities and for yourself, but for all of us. And I really appreciate you so much. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you, friends. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this thoughtful conversation with Wilfredo Hernandez. To learn more about the Drag Arts Oral History Project, visit dragartsohp.com.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of From Here with a View, a We Are the Seeds Philadelphia podcast. Please subscribe, share with a friend, and leave us a review. You'll be helping us grow our listener community and elevate the impact of our podcast. You can learn more about this podcast at wearetheseeds.org. From Here with a View is executive produced by Michelle St. John with Zachariah Julian and Tailinh Agoyo producing. Sound mixing and original theme music by Zachariah Julian. To listen to more from Zachariah, follow him on Spotify and Apple Music. From Here with a View logo art was inspired by an original oil pastel drawing by artist Jason Weesaw. Graphic design by Fernanda Leon. This podcast was funded in part by Independence Public Media Foundation.